Hello everyone, my name is Ashish and welcome to the X-Admin channel. So today in this lecture we are going to discuss the more interview questions on a Spring Boot. And in my previous lecture we have discussed the questions like what happens when a Spring boot starts. So we have discussed very internally that what steps are taken by a Spring Boot when we start the Spring Boot application and how the Tomcat server starts. And also we have discussed the internal flow and the high level flow of the Spring Boot. And before that, we have discussed the Spring Boot architecture. So, what are the layers of a Spring Boot? And also, we have discussed the Spring Framework versus Spring Boot versus Spring MVC, right? So, these are my previous lecture on a Spring Boot topic. So, if you have not watched yet, then you can visit the X-Admin channel and then you can watch my previous lecture on a Spring Boot. So, today we will move ahead with the interviews questions like what is the combination annotation for at the rate spring boot application. So this is the important question which you may get, that what is the combination of a spring boot application. So basically this at the rate spring boot application annotation consists three annotations. First, at the rate enable auto configuration. It enables the spring boot auto configuration mechanism. So as we know that if we are using a spring boot, then it is means it is auto configurable. As a developer we does not need to configure much, unlike the spring mvc. So spring mvc, we know that we have to do the configuration. We have to download all the jars and put all the jars in a class path. But this is not the case in a spring boot. Actually all these things are done automatically by a spring boot application. So this is the annotation at the rate enable auto configuration do for us. And the next annotation is at the rate component scan. So at the rate component scan, it scans the package where the application is located. So it basically scan where our controllers are located, and where are our component classes are there, and where the beans are there. So all these are scanned by the like uh, by the container of a spring, right? And also it consists one more annotation, that is at the rate configuration. So it allows us to register extra bean in the context or import additional configuration classes. So these are basically three annotations, and it is come under a single a spring boot application. So in place of at the rate spring boot application annotation, we can use these three annotation. But but the spring boot has given this a single annotation which does these three works. It enables the auto configuration, it also scan the component, and also it does the configurations, right? So also we can verify here. So let's go to our the main class of a spring boot, where at the rate spring boot application annotation is there, right? So this at the rate spring boot applications is in the main class, and this is the starting point of a spring boot. So when we run our spring boot application, so first most this class get runs, and here the web container or the application context uh, read this at the rate spring boot application. So if you will go inside, then you can see that Spring Boot configuration is there at the rate enable auto configuration at the rate component scan. So these are the annotations. It comes under at the rate Spring Boot. So if you'll go to the enable auto configuration, so you can see that enable auto configuration of a Spring application context attempting to guess and configure beans that are likely to need. Auto configuration classes are usually applied based on the class path and what beans you have defined. For example, let's say for an example, if you have taken means if you have a Tom Tomcat embedded .jar. It means that the application context will know that you are going to use the Tomcat server, right? So he will do the auto configuration for the Tomcat embedded server, right? So these type of like configuration are done automatically by a Spring Boot. So for this at the rate auto configuration like annotation is used, right? So in the similar way, we have the different like annotations uh, like component scan. So here in the component scan you can see that configures component scanning directives for use with the classes, right? So it scans all the classes and it collects like the controller class and the bean class and the component class and the service class like separately. So all these are done by the Spring container, right? So now let's go to the slide. So Spring Boot application consists of these three annotations: enable auto configuration, component scan, and at the rate configuration, right? So let's move to the next question, that what are the Spring Boot starters and what are the available starter? So basically a Spring Boot starter are set of dependency. So these are the set of the dependency management providers that can be used in the application to enable the dependency. So basically, in a Spring Boot, inside our pom.xml file, we define all the dependencies. So let's say that in a Spring application, I want to use a Tomcat server. I want to use Spring MVC. I want to connect with the MySQL database. So for that, we have to define the dependencies inside our pom.xml, right? So all these comes as a starter, right? So Spring Boot starter are set of dependencies management providers that can be used in application to enable the dependencies. So these starters makes development easy and rapid. And this come under org.springframework.boot.group, right? So these are the few starters I have defined here in the slide, and they are like a Spring Boot starter. So I hope you have seen this Spring Boot starter in our pom.xml. So this is basically a core starter which includes the logging, auto configuration supports, and the YAML and extractor, right? So this is a Spring Boot starter. So in a similar way, if you want to connect with the JDBC, then for that you have to add another starter with the name Spring Boot Starter JDBC. So this starter is used for connection with the JDBC. Now let's say that you have to develop the web application, which includes the use of a Spring MVC, also the RESTful web services and other things. So for that, you have to include Spring Boot Starter Web in your pom.xml. In a similar way, if you want to connect with use a JPA, right? So for that, you have to add Spring Boot Starter Data JPA. So this is a starter which helps to connect with the database using Spring Data JPA. So basically, if you want to do the CRUD operations, so Spring Boot JPA provide all the methods, the inbuilt method, right? So we need to only call that method. Let's say I want to save some object inside my database and I want to use a JPA. So for that, we have to add these starters in our pom.xml, and then we can use it. If you want to use Spring security, so for that Spring Boot starter security you can use, right? In the similar way, if you want to use AOP, then Spring Boot starter AOP you have to add inside the pom.xml. So let's move to our Eclipse. Let's open the pom.xml and let's check where these starters are. So first, so this is the Spring Boot starter parent. Okay, so this is the main the core starter from where mm, it actually it inherits all the dependencies from a Spring Boot starter parent, right? And let's say that you want to use the actuator. So for that you have to add these dependencies: Spring Actuator, In the similar way, if you want to use, yeah, so here you can see that if you want to use actuator, then so org.springframework.boot and spring boot starter and the actuator. So this is the artifact name, and this is the whole dependencies you have to add in your pom.xml if you're using the actuator. So in the similar way, if you want to use the wave, then you have to add these dependencies, Spring Boot starter wave inside your pom.xml. In the similar way, a dev tool. So basically, if you want to use a dev tool, then you have to add these dependencies. So the main point that if you want to use any of these dependencies, then you have to add this in a pom.xml, and this is the starter. Right, so this starter gives you the jar, and all these jar get downloaded into the maven dependencies like folder here. So you can see that whatever dependencies you will define, all these dependencies will be downloaded in a form of jar, and it will be stored inside your maven dependencies, right? So now let's move to our next question, that explain a Spring Boot actuator and its advantages. So basically, a Spring Boot actuator is one of the component of a Spring Boot by which we can check the status of our application or a project, or we can monitor the application in a different environment. With the help of the actuator, we can debug our application. So with the help of the Spring Actuator, it is easy to access the features such as identifying beans, CPU uses, health slash status, thread dump of the application. So basically, we can check the status and also we can debug our application, right? So in a Spring Boot version 1, it will show all the endpoints like bean, info, thread, dump. All these endpoints are enabled by default in a Spring Boot version 1. But with a Spring Boot version 2, only two endpoints are activated or like visible to you, and they are like slash actuator slash health and the actuator slash info. So these are the only two endpoints are visible or enable by default when you are using a Spring Boot version 2. So if you have to enable all the other like endpoints to monitor your application, then you have to enable those like endpoints through your application.property file, which I will show you in a some time. So let's go to our Eclipse. Okay, so this is my actuator like project I have already built. So here, so let me start this. So now let me start this actuator, and for this actuator you can see that I have added so yeah, so one more point, that if you want to use the actuator component in your like Spring Boot, then you have to add these dependencies in your pom.xml. So it will download the actuator jar inside your like a maven dependencies package, right? So this thing only you have to add, and it will activate your like actuator inside your Spring Boot application or a project. So now the next point, if I will start my actuator project, so let me delete the console. Yeah, so this is my basically a console, and now let me start this actuator project, run as a Java application. So now you will see, and here I am using a Spring Boot version 2, right? 2.0.1. So here basically if you're using the actuator, then only two endpoints will be enabled by default. So which you can verify here. So these are the two endpoints which are enabled by default, only two endpoint. You can see actuator health and the actuator info, right? So let's access this actuator health and see that what info we are getting in the response with this endpoint. So for that, let's go to our postman. and here I have pasted is Actuator health, and I'm running in my local, so I have added my domain name and the Actuator slash health. Now let's hit the send button. So you will see the status that status is up, and here we have a active internet connection. So in my laptop you can see that I have active internet connection. So this is showing the status of our application, and also it is showing that status is up and the disk space. So total it's saying this amount of byte is there and the free space and the threshold space, right? And showing the status up. So now let's do one thing. Let's disconnect my internet. Okay, so now I have disconnected my internet, and now I will try to hit this endpoint. So here you can see the status is now showing down. It means that an error code were coming inactive internet connection. So by this endpoint actuator slash health, you can check the status of your application, that how much like space is there, and whether the internet connection is up or down. So basically actuator is used to check the status of your like application or a project, although you can create your own endpoint. So yeah, so that is the another topic. If you want me to create a lecture on that, then I will also like create how to create your own custom endpoint, and there you can define your custom status, right? So now let's move to yeah. So here I have shown you that Spring Boot version 2 has only two endpoint by default. Now how to activate all the other endpoints? So for that, what you have to do, you have to go to your like uh, like application.properties file in your project, and then you have to add these line like management.endpoints.wave.exposure.include, and you have to keep it as a star. So this will activate all the other endpoints by default in your application. So these line you have to add in your application.properties file. So with this, it will come to know that we are allowing or asking for exposure of all the other endpoints. So with the help of those endpoints, we can check the status. So let's move to our console, and now you can see we got like many endpoints now. For example, we get actuator slash bean, actuator slash health was already there, actuator slash condition, actuator slash config prog, environment, info, loggers, heap dump, thread dump, matrix. So by the use of this endpoint, we can check the status of your application. So let's say we want to check the bean. Okay, so so you can copy this endpoint and you can go to the postman, and then you can put here bean. So actuator slash bean. Let's hit the send button. So here you can see that these are the beans available inside my application or a Spring Boot project. So you will get in a form of response. So by this you can check the status of your bean, right? So in the similar way, we have the another endpoints. Let's check the heap dump or a thread dump. Let's check the thread dump. So you can copy this endpoint and you can paste this over the postman. So now you can check the thread dump. So these are the threads running inside my application. Simple post director thread 0. Okay. And this is another thread name thread 18. So this give you the all the information about the thread running in your application. So basically the actuator is used for checking the status of your application, and it contains the different endpoints, and the endpoints which I have shown you here, like the matrix and the scheduled task. So this will show you if you have any scheduled task in your application, right? So these are the endpoints by which you can check the status, and you have to remember that by default only two endpoints are activated if you are in a Spring Boot like 2 point version. So for if you want to use other endpoints, then you have to activate it by writing this in a pom.xml file, right? So you have to include this like management.endpoint.wave.exposure.include equals to star. So this will expose all the other endpoints, right? So basically the actuator uh, is used to monitor your application in a different environment, by which you can debug your application, you can check the thread dumps and the other info, right? So this is the important questions which you also get in an interview. Now next question is that what is a theme leaf and how to use the theme leaf, right? So basically a theme leaf is a server side Java template engine used for web application, right? So we know that if you are building a web application, then there can be like three part. The the first part is like front end, and the next is the back end, right? So in the front end, basically the UI is there. In the back end, all the logics are there, and also the database, right? So so with the Spring Boot, we can build the REST API and the backend service. But with the help of this theme leaf component, it allows us to add our like UI in our Spring Boot application. So basically, a theme leaf is a server-side Java template engine used for web application. It aims to bring natural template of your web application and can integrate well with a Spring framework with HTML5 web. So let's say that if you want to use the HTML inside your Spring Boot, then for that you have to use the theme leaf. So to use the theme leaf, again you need to add these dependencies inside your pom.xml, right? So let's go to our Eclipse. So already I have like created one project for the theme leaf for you. So first go to the pom.xml and let's check the pom.xml. So here you will see, so this is the dependency you have to add in your project if you want to use the theme leaf. Spring Boot dash starter dash theme leaf, right? So this is the server side engine which give you the template or the HTML file, right? Now what you have to do, now let's say that you want to add HTML. So where you have to add inside your resource, and then here is a template folder. So inside template you can add your index.html. So I have already added HTML and I have written this content, and also I have created one endpoint to use this template or the HTML. So this is my controller. So here in the controller, you can see that I have made this controller and also created one endpoint with the request mapping slash index. And then here I am returning the index, right? So here as I'm using the theme leaf, and here it is marked as a controller. So we know that a controller annotation is used for returning the HTML or the JavaScript or the JSP in a response, right? So this is the endpoint I have added and returning here index. So container will check, and it will so first it is knowing that we are using the theme lib. So it will check that whether the same name HTML is present inside our template or not. So the Spring container will find that we have our index.html, then it will return this index.html in a response. So if you want to check this, then I have to start a server again for this application. So terminate the previous one. Now again start the server, run as Java application. So now my theme leaf project is running on port number 8080. Fine. And now I will access this endpoint from my like browser. So what you have to do basically, let's go to the postman, let's copy this, go to the browser, and here just change xadmin, and this was the index. So this is the end point, right? Now hit it. So you will see that we are rendering a HTML here. We are using thymeleaf Spring Boot web application, right? So from where it is coming? It is coming from index.html. So inside the index.html, I have written we are using thymeleaf Spring Boot application, right? So in this way, we are rendering our HTML directly, right? So this is the use of a theme leaf. So theme leaf is basically like one of the component of a Spring Boot, and it is a server side like a Java template engine to render template for the UI purpose, right? And you have to add these dependencies inside your pom.xml to use the theme leaf component. So the next question you may get, that can we change the port of a embedded Tomcat server in a Spring Boot? Yes, we can do that. And for that, you have to add server dot port equals to, and then you have to give the port number from which you want to start in your application or properties file. So now I will show you that by default it has started on port number 8080, right? Now I want to change this port number. So what we can do, we have to go to the application properties file, and then you have to write server dot port equals to, and then you have to give your port number, let's say 8082, and then you have to save it. So here it will, so now you will see that it is Tomcat started on port number 8082, right? So now if you want to access this, so you might get an error because port so now our application is running on port number 8082, and now you can access this, right? So in this way you can change the port number of your embedded Tomcat server by writing server.port, and then you have to give your port number. So your application will start in this particular port number, right? So the next question is that what is the need for a Spring Boot dev tool? So this is the important component, I believe, for a developer, because in Spring Boot 1.3 version, we got a Spring Boot dev tool component. So this will restart your application by itself whenever you do any changes in your code. Let's say that you are a developer, and you are developing one web application in a Spring Boot. So we know that always we need to change the code again and again. So again and again you have to go to the means again and again you have to start your server, and then you have to check your implementation. But if you are using a Spring Boot dev tool, then it is not required as a developer to restart the server. It will do for you. As you will save the file, then it will restart the server again, right? So this is the like the use of a Spring Boot dev tool. So how you can define this? So for this, you have to define in a pom.xml. So again, I will open the pom.xml, and inside the pom.xml, you will see that we have defined our dev tool dependencies, right? So this is a dependency you have to add inside your pom.xml if you want to use a dev tool, Spring Boot dev tool, and the scope is like runtime and the optional is true, right? So this is the dependencies you have to add inside your pom.xml if you want to use a dev tool. So dev tool, so let's see how it works. So let's go to the any of this like index.html, right? And now what I will add here one thing, okay? And now as I will save, so you will see that our server will start by itself. As a developer, I does not need to restart the server. Now I will save this file. So index.html file is saved, and now, okay, so this is the HTML file. Basically, it does not require to start your server. So I will change in my this, yeah. So here, if I will write xadmin s, And now I will save this controller file. So you can see that our application get restarted by itself. As a developer, I does not do to do anything, and again it will start in our port number 8082, right? So now I will revert this change, and if I will save it, so it will restart it again. You can see, right? So this is the this is done by a dev tool. So basically, a dev tool is used to restart your server in a backend. As a developer, you does not need to restart your server after your implementation, right? So only you need to save your file and it will restart. So the next question is that what are the advantages of using a YAML file than a properties file? So actually we have like we can use two type of file in our application, in our Spring Boot application. The first is the application of properties file I have shown. So that is the property file, and the another we can use a YAML file. So basically a YAML file gives you more clarity than a property file. It also support maps, list, and the other scalar types. So YML file comes with a hierarchical nature which helps in avoiding the repetitions. So if you have a different deployment profile, let's say if you're using a profiler in your Spring Boot, so you have a different like servers, like a development phase, testing, and the production. So if you're using a profiler, then for that you have to define different configuration files if you're using a property file. But if you're using a YML, then simply you can write all this configuration of a profiler in a single YML file, right? By this way. But if you're using a property file, then I will show you. Then you have to create a different properties file. So where is the profiler? Yeah, so this is the profiles. Okay, so here in the resource you will see that I have created these three property file. The first is the like the basic one, and the another is application dash development dot properties, application dash production dot properties. So for the different environment I have to create a different properties file if you are using a property file. Here if you are using a YML file, then in a single YML file you can do this, right? And the YML file is like more clear to read for the developer. So this is the basically advantage of a YAML file. So although you can use any of this, so there, but the YAML file gives you the more clarity than the properties file. And YAML file also support maps and the list and the other like data types, right? So now let's move to the another question, that what is a profile and where it is used. So basically the application has a different stages, right? Such as the development stage and the testing stage and the production stage. So all these stages required a different database. For a development stage, you have to use your development database. For the testing, you can use a testing like database. And for the production, you have to use a production environment or a database, right? So for this, so in a Spring Boot, we have a component with a profiles which allows you to use a different environment for your different stages. So how we do this? So for this, we have to create, if you're using a property file, then you have to create a different like properties file. So like I will show you here. So this is my profiles like application where I have used the profile like component. So for this what I have to do, so here you can see, so this is my application to properties file, right? So here I have defined my like MySQL driver like configuration, and here you will see spring dot profiles dot active, and here I have written the production. So it means that now it will use the production environment. So for that what I have to do, so again I have created more two properties file. One with the name application dash development properties, application dot production properties. So I will open this development properties, and here I have written the MySQL configuration, and here I have given the database with the name development. And for the production, I have another configuration, and here I have given the database name with the production, and here I have given with the name like development, right? So these are the two configuration I have created for a different environment. So now inside my application properties file, here you have to mention spring.profile.active equals to production. So it will pick up this like property file application dash production dot properties file. If I will write here like development, then it will pick up these property file, and then it will use these configuration for my like MySQL, and it will, and according to this configuration it will use the development like database, right? So by this way we can define the profiles inside our Spring Boot application, and this is used to use the different environment for the different stages, right? So here you can replace the profiles with whatever environment you need. For example, if it is development profile, then the application.development.properties file will be the development specific configuration in it, right? So in order to have the profile specific configuration property, you need to spy an active profile. And like as I have shown you in the application.properties file, we have to define that which profile you want to use, right? So this is basically a profile component of a Spring Boot, which uh, is useful for using different environments in a different stages of your application. Now the next question is that how to connect a Spring Boot to a database using a JPA. So for that you have to include Spring Boot starter JPA inside your pom.xml, right? So as I have shown you, so let's go to the another project where I have used JPA. So this is the pom.xml. So if you want to use a Spring data JPA, so you have to include these dependencies inside your pom.xml, right? So this will download the jar for a Spring data JPA in your project, and you can use the JPA. And if you're using the JPA, then you have to create the repository also. So inside the repository, I will show you. So yeah, so basically this is the interface, the repository interface, and it is extending our JPA repository. So basically a JPA repository is used to connect with the database, and it provides the different method. So all the CRUD operation method are there inside a JPA repository, right? So you can use those method, and you can do the CRUD operation. So this is the JPO repository, and here inside this you can see that find all method is there. If you want to find uh, the object available in your database, right? So you can find any information or the object from your database. If you want to find by the ID, then you can use find all by ID. So these are the methods which are already defined inside your JPO repository, right? So by this way we can connect with the JPA repository. Now the next question is that what is the difference between at the rate rest controller and at the rate controller annotation? So basically the controller at the rate so basically both annotations are used for defining a class as a controller, first of all. So the only difference is that with the REST controller, it includes at the rate controller plus at the rate response body. So if you don't want to use at the rate REST controller, then you can use these both annotation in your class with the name at the rate controller and the at the rate response body. But in a Spring Boot version 4, a single annotation has been provided for you And for that, now you don't require to use these two annotations, at the rate controller and at the rate response body. With the single at the rate rest controller, you can do. So the main difference is that if you are familiar with the REST web services, then you know that the fundamental difference between a web application and a REST API is that in the response from the web application is generally HTML plus CSS plus JavaScript. If you're using a web application, then we are getting the response as a HTML plus CSS plus JavaScript, as I have shown you in the theme leaf. With the help of the theme leaf component, we can get the response in a HTML, right? and and there I have used at the rate controller. So there I have not used at the rate rest controller. So let me show you that also. So here in the theme leaf, so now in a theme leaf I need to get the response in a HTML or a JavaScript. So for that you cannot use at the rate rest controller. So in the controller class, you will see that I have used at the rate controller, not at the rest controller, right? Because with the help of that the controller, you can we will get the response in a HTML, CSS, or a JavaScript. But if we will use at the rest controller, then basically it is used in the REST API, where you will get a response in a form of JSON or in a XML. So in the REST API, the default is like JSON format, right? So the difference is that in at the rate controller and at the rest controller, the job of the at the rate controller is to create a map of a model object and find a view. Means you will get a response in a form of view or in a HTML file, which will contain the CSS and the JavaScript. But if you're using at the rate rest controller, then you will get the response in a form of JSON or XML. If you're using a REST API, then you will get in a form of JSON, right? So this is the main difference, that that with the at the rate controller, you will get the response in a form of HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. And if you're using at the rate rest controller, then you will get the response in a JSON format. And yeah, so this is the main difference between the at the rate controller and the rest controller. Okay, so these are the only topics or the questions I have discussed in this lecture. So in the next lecture we will discuss the more important questions which you will get in a Spring Boot session. So thank you and have a nice day.